Part 2. The silence in the cave was deafening. For a moment, it felt as though the creature, whatever it was waiting for them to make the first move. The only sound was their breathing, shallow and quick as they stood frozen in the dark chamber. Corey, unable to contain his curiosity, took a cautious step forward. His heart hammered in his chest as he flicked his flashlight toward the creature's glowing eyes. The beam of light hit it for a brief second, and for that instant, he could see its shape. A tall, thin figure with elongated limbs and a twisted posture, almost humanoid, but not quite. "Is it moving?" Ryan whispered, his voice tight with unease. Corey barely managed to nod. "I think it is," slowly. The creature didn't seem to react to their presence immediately, as if it were studying them just as they were studying it. They could feel its gaze, but it never moved toward them. Matt's voice broke through the tension. "What the hell is it? We need to get out of here." Corey hesitated. "We can't leave now. We've found something. Something real." Ryan clenched his jaw. "It's real, but so is the danger. We need to get back to the surface, and we need to do it now." But Corey wasn't ready to give up so easily. "Wait. Let's just see what it does. We might learn something." The creature finally stirred, slowly turning its head toward them. The movement was so unnatural, almost like it was stiff, like an old machine waking up. The more Corey stared, the more details became clear. Its skin was pale and almost translucent in places, its face elongated with sharp features, and the eyes, those glowing eyes, stared back at them with an intensity that felt almost human. Ryan stepped back, unease overtaking him. "I don't care what it is, Corey. I'm not sticking around to find out." But before anyone could respond, a new sound filled the air, a low, rumbling growl, like the earth itself was groaning. It came from deep within the cave, a sound they had never heard before. Corey, frozen in place, could feel the temperature drop. A cold sweat ran down his back as the creature took a step forward, its eyes never leaving them. "We need to go," Ryan repeated, his voice desperate. Corey looked at Matt, who nodded grimly. The creature's slow approach had made it clear that they were no longer welcome in this strange part of the cave. Without another word, they turned and began to move back toward the narrow tunnel they had entered through. But as they walked, they heard a rustle behind them. It wasn't the creature. It was something else. Out of the shadows, several more figures emerged, similar creatures with the same glowing eyes, moving with unnerving silence. The creatures surrounded them, creating a circle that seemed to close in with each step. "Run!" Corey shouted. The three of them bolted down the narrow tunnel, not daring to look behind. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the cave, mingling with the growls and shrieks of the creatures. They pushed forward, their hearts pounding as the creatures' cries grew louder behind them. Their path felt like it was closing in on them, like the cave itself was alive, constricting and pressing in. They were trapped. But then, as if by some miracle, they saw the faint light of the cave entrance up ahead. "Almost there!" Ryan yelled, his voice full of raw panic. With one last burst of energy, they reached the entrance and scrambled out into the open air. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their truck, breathing heavily and covered in dirt, sweat and fear. The three friends sat in their truck, trying to process what had just happened. The cave, the creatures, the terrifying growls, everything felt surreal, as if their minds couldn't fully grasp what they had witnessed. Corey was the first to speak, his voice shaky. What the hell were those things?" Matt shook his head. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like that. This isn't something we should have messed with." Ryan remained silent for a moment, staring out the windshield at the forest that surrounded them. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the events that had just unfolded. "I never should have let you talk me into going back in. It was stupid. We almost didn't make it out alive." "Stop it, Ryan," Corey snapped. "You can't blame yourself. We all went in together." But Matt wasn't as quick to defend the trip. "Yeah, well, that doesn't mean we should have gone back in. The cave? It was different this time. Those creatures were waiting for us. It was like they knew we were coming." Ryan clenched his fists. "I don't care what it was. I don't ever want to see it again. We should have left the moment we found the entrance." Corey stared at the map spread out in his lap, the familiar markings of the cave drawn in with a red pen. "We were so close, though. We couldn't turn back now. We have to know what that was, what's going on in there." Matt groaned in frustration. Corey, there's nothing there. We saw it with our own eyes. Those creatures, whatever they were, are real. There's something we don't understand. Corey's expression darkened as he looked at the map. Maybe they're not the only thing in there. Maybe there's something even worse. The thought lingered in the air between them like a heavy weight. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the cave. It wasn't just the creatures. They were part of something bigger. There was a presence there, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for them. We can't go back, Ryan said firmly, his voice filled with finality. We're done with that cave. It's over. Matt nodded in agreement. I'm with Ryan. We should just forget about it. But Corey wasn't so easily swayed. He folded the map and stuffed it into his backpack, his eyes still focused on the empty road ahead. We may never find another cave like it, he muttered. I can't just walk away from this. Ryan and Matt exchanged a glance, but neither of them argued further. Deep down, they both knew that Corey would keep pushing, no matter what. The drive back was silent, the weight of their experience hanging heavily in the air. As they left the forest behind, the shadows of the trees seemed to follow them, as if the creatures in the cave were still watching, waiting for their next move. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty. The three friends tried to go back to their normal lives, but they couldn't shake the memory of the cave, the creatures, and the strange, oppressive feeling that had followed them out. They tried to talk to other diggers, other explorers, but no one believed them. The ridicule and disbelief were overwhelming. Are you sure you didn't just hallucinate? One of their friends had asked. I mean, those creatures. Come on, guys. That sounds like something out of a movie. Do you think we'd make this up? Corey had snapped back. But the more they explained, the more they were met with skepticism. The cave had become a joke to everyone but them, and the creatures they had seen were written off as a figment of their imaginations. The three of them gathered again, weeks later, sitting in the same truck that had brought them to safety. The map lay between them, the cave marked with a red X. We've got to find it again, Corey said quietly. Matt shook his head. No, we've been through this. We can't just let it go, Corey insisted. There's something there, something we have to figure out. It's not just a story, it's real. Ryan looked at Corey, his face hardening. Corey, I'm done. I'm done with this. I don't care what's in that cave. I'm not going back. Matt nodded. I'm with Ryan. This has gone too far. Corey looked at them both, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. You may be done, but I'm not. The trio's bond had been strained, and after that day, they didn't speak much about the cave or the creatures that had haunted them. But Corey couldn't let it go. He spent sleepless nights searching for information, trying to connect the dots, trying to find the cave again. He went back to the forest alone, hoping for answers. But every time he thought he was close, he found nothing. The entrance, it seemed, had disappeared. They never found it again. The cave was gone, and no one would ever believe what had happened to them. Weeks passed, and Corey couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was still out there, hidden somewhere in the dense forest. Every time he drove through the woods, he'd find himself looking for any sign of the entrance, any hint of the mysterious place that had nearly cost them their lives. But it was as though the forest had swallowed it up, as if the cave had never existed. Ryan and Matt had gone back to their usual routines, their lives returning to normal. But Corey wasn't ready to give up. He kept obsessing over the cave, poring over old maps and notes, trying to find any clue that might lead him back. He even contacted other amateur diggers, but no one seemed to know anything about the cave. The more he searched, the more frustrated he became. One evening, as Corey sat alone in his garage, going over his notes once again, he felt a strange unease. The memories of the cave, the creatures, the growing sense of danger, came rushing back, filling him with a chilling feeling. It was as if something was calling him back to that place, pulling him toward it despite everything that had happened. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the cave was still waiting for him, like it was alive in some way, watching him from the shadows. Corey made up his mind. He reached out to Ryan and Matt, hoping they would join him again, but neither of them seemed willing to face the cave. They had moved on, dismissing it as a terrifying experience that they didn't want to relive. Ryan had been clear. Corey, It's gone. It's over. You need to let it go. But Corey couldn't. Not yet. He spent several more days driving through the forest, mapping out every possible route, retracing his steps. He brought a few other friends who were also into amateur caving, people who hadn't been there the first time. They all thought he was crazy, but they agreed to go along, hoping to get some answers. The group trekked into the woods, and for hours they searched, going deeper and deeper into the dense forest, past the places Corey thought he remembered. As the sun began to set, and with no sign of the cave in sight, the group was ready to call it quits. But Corey couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "Let's just check one more area." The others hesitated, but finally agreed, unsure whether to humor him or just get it over with. They followed Corey through the dense brush, and after what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an overgrown path. "I think this is it," Corey said, his pulse quickening. His instincts were screaming that they were close. As they walked further, they noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the forest grew quieter, as though they had crossed some invisible threshold. The hairs on the back of Corey's neck stood up, and then they saw it. An opening in the ground, barely visible, covered by tangled roots and dense foliage. "It's the entrance," Corey whispered, his voice barely audible. They cleared the overgrowth and stood in front of the opening. Corey's heart raced. He felt the same uneasy sense of dread he had felt that first time, but this time it was different. This time it was even more intense. The group stood there, staring at the dark opening that led into the cave they thought was lost forever. "We shouldn't go in," one of the others said, his voice shaky. "This place is dangerous." But Corey was already stepping forward, unable to stop himself. He wasn't going to let the cave slip away again. He had to know what was in there. As they ventured inside, the atmosphere felt thicker than before, heavier, colder. The air was filled with an odd, musty smell that made it hard to breathe. The passageways twisted and turned, and the deeper they went, the darker it became. Corey felt as though the cave was drawing them in, as though it knew they had returned. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a familiar chamber, the one where they had first encountered the creatures. But now everything was different. The walls were slick with moisture, the floor uneven and slippery. The air felt wrong, charged with an unseen presence. And then they saw it. The creatures. They were watching from the shadows again, their glowing eyes visible in the dark. This time, though, they didn't remain still. They moved, slowly creeping toward them, their limbs unnaturally long, their twisted forms blending with the darkness. Corey froze. The others behind him looked just as terrified. The creatures made no sound, but Corey could feel their presence all around him. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. In the blink of an eye, one of the creatures lunged at the group. The others screamed and scrambled to get away, but Corey was frozen in place, watching as the creature disappeared back into the shadow. Corey didn't dare look back. He pushed through another narrow passage, his mind racing. What had happened to the other two? Where were Danny and Tom? They had all been so close to each other, and yet Corey hadn't seen or heard them since the descent into the darkness. Were they still alive? Or had they already fallen victim to whatever lurked in these caves? Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, Corey burst into a large cavern. He stopped, panting, sweat pouring down his face, the flashlight shaking in his hand. He could hear nothing now, just the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He turned slowly in a circle, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The cavern was eerily quiet, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. And then, from the darkness, came a sound that sent a chill straight through him. A soft, dragging footstep. He wasn't alone. The creatures were here. Corey swallowed hard, clutching the flashlight tighter as he prepared to face whatever was coming. He had to find his way out, but he had no idea which direction to go. He had no map, no guide. Only the overwhelming feeling that something was watching him. Something just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Another step, closer. The sound of the dragging footstep grew closer, sending a fresh wave of panic through Corey. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light across the walls of the cavern, illuminating jagged rocks and strange, unrecognizable marks that seemed to stain the stone like something had clawed at it. No, scratched it. The hairs on his neck stood on end. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, all he could do was listen, straining to hear. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows, and Corey's heart skipped a beat. The creatures were close, too close. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his senses sharpened in terror, but his body froze. Then, just as he thought the creature would emerge from the darkness, a whisper rang out, faint but clear. Corey? Corey's heart hammered in his chest. He knew that voice. It was Tom. Tom? Corey whispered urgently, his voice quaking. His body tensed, and he instinctively moved toward the source of the sound, hoping it was his friend, hoping it wasn't some trick of his mind. Corey, get out of here! The voice was weak, strained. You have to. The growl came again, louder this time, cutting through the air like a blade. Corey didn't wait. He spun on his heel and ran, the light flicking across the walls as he moved. The path he'd come from was no longer an option. He could feel it in his bones, the sensation of something close behind him, moving, stalking. Whatever it wasn't human. But what about Tom? What had happened to him? Corey turned the corner sharply, almost slipping on the slick, uneven floor. He didn't dare slow down. He couldn't afford to think about the voice, the warning. It was all too much. His mind felt overloaded, his body pushed to the limit, but one thought stuck in his mind. Get out. Get out now. Suddenly, a flash of movement in the darkness caught his attention. He swung the flashlight toward it, his breath catching in his throat. A shadow. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was tall, too tall for a human, its form distorted and wrong. It had elongated limbs, and its shape seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, almost like a mirage, as if the very air around it couldn't hold its shape. Corey stopped dead in his tracks. His heart raced as the creature moved, a slow, calculated step forward. It wasn't rushing, wasn't in a hurry. It was toying with him. The flashlight trembled in Corey's grip, casting wild shadows on the walls, and for a moment he swore he saw more than one shape moving just beyond the beam of light. Shadows, too many to count. Corey's mind screamed at him to move. He had to leave. The cave, whatever it was hiding, was no longer a place of discovery. It was a tomb, but his body wouldn't respond. And then, just as the creature in front of him made another step, something else broke through the silence. A shout. Danny's voice. Corey! Run! Corey's body reacted on instinct. He turned, pushed off the ground, and ran as fast as he could. His heart thundered in his chest, and the flashlight bounced wildly in his hand. The growling, the footsteps, they all seemed to close in around him. But he could hear Danny now calling from somewhere in the distance. Corey! This way! Hurry! Corey's legs burned, but he didn't stop. He followed the sound of Danny's voice, weaving through the maze of tunnels. He could barely see now. His flashlight had flickered out completely. His only hope was to follow the sounds, the footsteps of his friends. And then, finally, he saw it, a small light in the distance. Danny! But as he neared it, he realized it wasn't Danny. It was another figure, a shadow moving in the light of a small fire. Corey stopped, just out of the light's reach. His breath was ragged and his eyes darted around, but there was no sign of his friends. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was low, deep, a voice Corey didn't recognize. It was coming from the shadows. It wasn't Danny. It wasn't Tom. Corey's blood ran cold. Corey's heart hammered in his chest, a constant, maddening rhythm. The voice from the shadows had sent a chill through his entire body. He could feel his legs shaking beneath him, and his mind raced, searching for any hint of logic to explain what was happening. But nothing made sense. His friends were supposed to be here. They had to be. Who are you? Corey's voice barely broke through the suffocating silence, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if the shadow even heard him. The figure in the darkness remained still, but Corey could feel its presence growing stronger, more ominous. He took a hesitant step forward, eyes straining to make out any detail, but the light from the small fire was too faint. It cast more shadows than it revealed, and every corner of the cavern seemed to hold something waiting. "Why are you here?" the voice asked again, a harsh whisper that seemed to echo off the walls. "You should have stayed away." Corey's pulse quickened. This wasn't a person. This wasn't a guide or a rescuer. It was something else. Something wrong. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He couldn't leave his friends behind, not if they were still somewhere in this nightmare of a cave. I'm looking for my friends, Corey said, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. Tom, Danny, have you seen them? Where are they? The figure remained silent, and for a moment, Corey thought he would get no answer. But then, the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of something darker. They are not what they seem, it said, its tone a mix of amusement and something colder. And neither are you. Corey's blood ran cold. What did that mean? He had to know. Had something happened to his friends? Were they still human? I don't understand, Corey murmured, his voice breaking. Please, tell me what's going on. A soft, mocking laugh echoed from the shadows, but it wasn't a sound Corey wanted to hear. It made his skin crawl, sending an instinctual sense of dread through him. He wasn't just talking to a person. This was something ancient, something that had lived far longer than any human being. And it didn't care about Corey or his friends. You should never have come, the figure said again, stepping closer, just enough for the light to catch its silhouette. It wasn't human. Not at all. Corey's breath hitched as he realized it had features he couldn't understand, eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, skin that shimmered like liquid, and long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Before Corey could react, the figure retreated into the shadows once again, disappearing like smoke. Suddenly, a voice called from behind him. Corey, is that you? It was Danny's voice. Corey's heart leaped. He spun around, relief flooding his chest at the sound of his friend's familiar call. Danny! Corey shouted, rushing toward the voice, not caring about the strange presence he had just encountered. Danny, But then, as he reached the edge of the firelight, he froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. The figure standing there wasn't Danny. It wasn't even human. It had the same shimmering skin, the same glowing eyes as the creature in the shadows. It smiled at Corey. No, it grinned, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The creature stepped forward, its movement graceful, yet unnervingly unnatural. I told you to leave, it said, its voice echoing the same haunting tone from before. But now, you will stay. Corey backed away, his mind reeling, his body paralyzed with fear. He turned his back on the creature, racing back toward the cavern. His breath came in gasps, and he stumbled over the uneven ground. The shadows were closing in again. They were everywhere. A sudden cry echoed through the cave, a scream. It sounded like Tom. Corey didn't stop to think. He ran toward the sound, his heart in his throat, praying that Tom was still alive, that they weren't too late. Corey's legs burned as he sprinted down the narrow, twisting corridors of the cave. The scream that echoed from deeper within the darkness still rang in his ears, the sound so desperate, so filled with fear, that it nearly paralyzed him. Was it Tom? Was it Danny? He had to find them. He had to get them out of here. Tom, Corey shouted, his voice hoarse as he pushed forward, weaving through the jagged rocks and the ever-deepening gloom. The cave seemed to grow colder the farther he went, the air thick with an oppressive silence that threatened to swallow him whole. Another scream split the air, sharper this time. It sent a chill down Corey's spine, and he broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in on him, each step feeling like it took him further away from the safety he once took for granted. He rounded a corner and froze. Ahead of him, he could see two figures standing motionless in the dark. The light from his flashlight flickered weakly, barely enough to illuminate their faces. But Corey didn't need the light to know what he was seeing. It wasn't Tom or Danny. The creatures were taller now, their forms more defined, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They were the same beings he had encountered earlier, their long limbs moving unnaturally, their skin shimmering with an iridescent sheen that sent a shiver down his spine. The air around them felt heavy, charged with a presence so wrong it made his skin crawl. Corey felt his breath catch in his throat as the figures turned their heads toward him, their glowing eyes locking onto his. The sound of a slow, rasping breath filled the air. And then, the creatures spoke, their voices overlapping in a distorted chorus. "You shouldn't be here," one of them hissed, its voice a blend of harsh whispers and guttural growls. "None of you should be here." Corey backed up, his pulse racing. This wasn't possible. None of this made sense. He had to get out. He had to find his friends. "Where are they?" he shouted, his voice desperate. "What did you do to them?" The creatures tilted their heads, their movements fluid and unnerving, like something out of a nightmare. One of them took a step closer, its eyes narrowing as it looked Corey up and down. "They are ours now," it replied coldly. "All of you are." A cold, terrible dread settled over Corey. He had to get out. But how? The ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew even colder, if that was possible. He heard a faint rustle from behind him and spun around, expecting to see something or someone coming for him. But there was nothing. The cave was eerily silent again, the creature's whispers fading into the shadows. He took a cautious step forward, but the strange sense of dread had not lifted. The creatures were still out there, watching him, waiting. But where was Tom? Where was Danny? Corey's thoughts raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What were these things? Why had they attacked them? Was it something they disturbed in the cave? A voice, a faint, trembling voice, broke through his frantic thoughts. "Corey, help!" Corey's heart stopped. It was Danny's voice. Weak, desperate. "Danny!" Corey cried out, a surge of adrenaline flooding his body. He ran toward the sound, his legs moving on their own, carrying him deeper into the cave, toward the voice that had called his name. "Tom! Danny!" he shouted, his voice cracking in the darkness. As he moved further into the labyrinth of the cave, he caught a glimpse of something ahead, something familiar. He couldn't make it out at first, but then the light from his flashlight caught it. There, lying against the wall, was Danny. Corey rushed to his side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Danny, oh my God, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside him. Danny's eyes were wide with fear, his face pale. He was breathing heavily, and his clothes were torn, dirt and blood smeared across his skin. They were here. Danny gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Corey, we have to get out. They're not human." Corey helped Danny sit up, his mind reeling with the implications of his words. "Where's Tom? What happened to him?" Danny's eyes flickered to the shadows. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know. Danny stuttered, trying to catch his breath. "There was something in the dark. It took him, Corey. We have to leave. Now." Corey's heart dropped into his stomach. The terror in Danny's eyes was enough to tell him everything. Something had happened to Tom, something horrible. Without thinking, Corey grabbed Danny's arm and pulled him to his feet. The two of them stumbled forward, desperate to escape the nightmare of the cave, but every step felt like they were walking deeper into it. And then, just as they thought they might make it out, a low growl filled the air. It was close. Too close. The growl reverberated through the cave, low and guttural, sending shivers down Corey's spine. He tightened his grip on Danny's arm, steadying his friend as they both froze, their breaths shallow and rapid. "Did you hear that?" Corey whispered, though the answer was obvious. Danny nodded, his face pale and drenched with sweat. It's one of them," Danny stammered, his voice barely audible. Corey swung his flashlight toward the sound, the beam trembling as his hands shook. The light caught nothing but jagged rocks and shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The oppressive silence returned, heavier now, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. "Keep moving," Corey urged, his voice firm despite the panic clawing at his chest. "We need to find Tom." Danny hesitated, his eyes darting to the darkness behind them. What if he's gone?" "He's not," Corey snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. "We don't leave him behind." Danny swallowed hard and nodded, the fear in his eyes giving way to a flicker of determination. Together, they pushed forward, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. Corey spun around, shining his flashlight into the shadows, and for a brief moment he saw it. A hunched skeletal figure with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. It moved with unnatural fluidity, its head tilting as if studying them. "Run!" Corey shouted, grabbing Danny's arm and pulling him down the tunnel. They sprinted blindly, the sound of their ragged breaths and pounding footsteps filling the air. The creature's growl grew fainter behind them, but Corey didn't dare slow down. He didn't trust the silence. It was too deceptive, too dangerous. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a large cavern. Corey skidded to a halt, his flashlight sweeping across the space. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the rock that glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. What is this?" Danny whispered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. Corey didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the center of the cavern, where a jagged rock formation jutted upward like a twisted spire. At its base, something was lying on the ground. "Tom!" Corey shouted, rushing forward. Tom was slumped against the spire, his face pale and his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, a sign that he was alive. "Tom, wake up!" Corey shook him gently, panic bubbling in his throat. Tom's eyes fluttered open and he let out a weak groan. "Corey, Danny." "We're here," Corey said, relief flooding his voice. "We're getting you out of here." Tom's eyes widened suddenly, his hand shooting up to grab Corey's wrist. "No, you can't stay here," he gasped. It's watching us." Danny's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cavern. The temperature dropped sharply, and a chilling wind swept through the space. "Corey." Danny's voice trembled. Corey turned, his stomach dropping as he saw them. 3 of the creatures, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. They moved slowly, their elongated limbs bending in unnatural ways as they closed in. "Get up!" Corey yelled, pulling Tom to his feet. Tom swayed unsteadily, leaning heavily on Corey for support. Danny stood frozen, his flashlight trained on the creatures as they advanced. "Danny, move!" Corey shouted. Danny snapped out of his trance, backing toward the tunnel they had come from. Corey and Tom followed, their movements slow and clumsy in the uneven terrain. The creatures didn't quicken their pace, but their presence was suffocating, their glowing eyes unblinking as they watched the 3 friends retreat. As they reached the tunnel, one of the creatures stopped and tilted its head, its mouth opening slightly. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, a sound that sent a wave of nausea through Corey. "Go!" he urged, practically dragging Tom into the narrow passage. The 3 of them stumbled forward, the light from their flashlights bouncing wildly. The creatures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a heavy, unshakable weight pressing down on them. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Corey turned to Tom, his voice strained. "What happened? What did they do to you?" Tom shook his head weakly, his eyes haunted. "I don't know. I blacked out, and when I woke up, I was here. They didn't touch me, but I could feel them. In my head, like they were searching for something." Danny shivered, his eyes darting to the darkness behind them. "We need to get out of here, now." Corey nodded, his grip on Tom tightening. "We're close. We just have to keep moving." But as they continued down the tunnel, Corey couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The creatures might have let them go, but the marks they had left, on Tom, on the walls of the cavern, on the air itself, felt permanent. The cave wasn't done with them yet. The tunnel stretched endlessly, twisting and narrowing with each step the group took. Corey and Danny struggled to help Tom along, their flashlight beams cutting through the suffocating darkness. Every sound, the scrape of their boots, the rustle of their clothing, felt amplified, echoing in the eerie silence. "How much further?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. Corey glanced over his shoulder, though he knew there was no answer to Danny's question. "We just keep going," he replied, his tone steady despite his growing dread. Tom stumbled, nearly dragging them both down. Corey caught him, adjusting his grip under Tom's arm. "Stay with us, man. We're getting out of here." Tom nodded weakly, his face pale and slick with sweat. I can feel them," he murmured. "They're watching." Danny's flashlight flickered again, casting jagged shadows along the walls. "Stop saying that," he snapped, his nerves fraying. "We're alone." But they all knew that wasn't true. A faint noise echoed from behind them, a soft shuffling sound, like something brushing against stone. Corey froze, his heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Danny nodded, his face taut with fear. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam illuminated nothing but empty rock. "We need to move faster," Corey said, his voice low and urgent. They pressed on, the tunnel growing narrower and steeper. The air was thick and damp, making every breath a struggle. Corey's legs burned with the effort of supporting Tom, but he didn't dare stop. The shuffling sound grew louder, accompanied by an occasional faint clicking. It wasn't just one noise, it was many, a chorus of movement that seemed to come from all directions. "They're following us," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. Corey didn't respond. He didn't need to. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into another chamber, this one smaller than the last. A faint breeze tickled their faces, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of fresh air. "We're close," Corey said, his hope rekindled. But their relief was short-lived. The clicking noises grew louder, more deliberate, as if the creatures were closing in. Danny shone his flashlight back into the tunnel they had just emerged from, his hand shaking. "I see them," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Corey turned, his stomach dropping. In the beam of Danny's light, the creatures lurked at the edge of the tunnel, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. They didn't advance but stood there, their elongated limbs shifting unnaturally. "Go!" Corey shouted, pushing Danny toward the opposite tunnel. They scrambled forward, the fresh air growing stronger with each step. The tunnel sloped upward, and Corey could feel his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Behind them, the clicking noises grew louder, closer. Corey didn't dare look back. "Almost there!" Danny yelled, his voice cracking. A faint light appeared ahead, spilling into the tunnel. It was the exit, the promise of freedom. They burst out of the cave, stumbling into the open air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the rocky landscape. The night was silent, save for the ragged breaths of the three friends. Corey turned to look at the cave entrance, not expecting to see the creatures emerging. But the darkness within was impenetrable, as if the cave itself had swallowed them whole. "They're not coming out," Danny said, his voice shaky. Tom sank to the ground, his face pale but his expression filled with relief. "We made it," he whispered. Corey didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the cave, his mind racing. The creatures hadn't chased them outside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their escape was no coincidence. The cave had let them go. But why? End of part 2.